This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jim McDowell, the Chancellor of the University of South Australia. Thank you for joining us tonight. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Kaurna land and pay tribute to the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of this land that we meet on. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationships with the land. The Hawke Centre is committed to delivering a diverse programme of events and exhibitions throughout the year, which reflect the fundamental themes of strengthening our democracy, valuing our diversity and building our future. In tonight's talk, Her Excellency Menna Rawlings, British High Commissioner to Australia, will explore the vision of Britain after Brexit. The session is being recorded and a video of the event will be available on the Hawke Centre website later next week. Because the sound of insistent mobile phone ringing adds little to the audio record of the proceedings, can I please ask that everybody switch your phones to silent now to avoid interruptions. You may, however, join the Twitter conversation using the links shown on the screen. We have a large number of special guests here tonight, and rather than read out all their names, I'll just a couple of people I would like to recognise. Consul General Chris Holtby, OBE, from Melbourne. Ian Smith, the Honorary Consul here in Adelaide and Managing Director of Bespoke Approach. And I'd also like to thank Nigel Relf in the front row, who's our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, External Relations and Strategic Projects at the University, for their support in making this event possible. Tonight we are here to discover what Britain will be like after the United Kingdom leaves the European Union in 2019. Brexit is a word that carries a lot of baggage, a word that brought more than 30 million people into the polling booths of the United Kingdom the 23rd of June 2016, more than half of whom voted to say goodbye to the alliance they joined in 1973 and then confirmed that joining with a referendum in 1975 when I was a first-year law student at the University of Warwick in England. While the divorce date is still more than a year away, there is enough confusion and uncertainty around as to what that divorce will look like. What will happen to the EU laws enforced in the UK? What happens to EU citizens living in the UK? What will happen to Britain's trading relationships? Economists who are normally not known for being upbeat agree that Brexit is likely to reduce the United Kingdom's real per capita income, already a rise in inflation since the result amounts to around £400 a year for the average British household. And then there's the question of the Irish border and how that is eventually going to be sorted, a matter which is dear to my own heart. However, tonight I would like to welcome you all here on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia to hear from British High Commissioner to Australia, Her Excellency Menna Rawlings. She is here to give us good news, the reasons to be cheerful. She hasn't been at the cricket today. Menna Rawlings has been British High Commissioner to Australia since April 2015. She joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1989 and has served in a wide range of diplomatic service roles. She was most recently a member of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office Management Board as Human Resources Director. This followed postings to Washington DC, Accra, Ghana, Israel, Kenya and Brussels. In London, she has served as Private Secretary to the Permanent Under-Secretary, as well as in the Press Office and in the Africa and European Union Directorates. Besides looking on the bright side of Brexit, Her Excellency will be taking part in a conversation with Professor Andy Elliott, Executive Director of the Hawke European Union Centre for Mobilities, Migration and Cultural Transformations. But now, please join me in welcoming Her Excellency Menna Rawlings.
Thanks very much, Jim, and good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here tonight at the Hawke Centre in the University of South Australia. I'm glad to say it's not my first visit to this university, and it's always great to be back and always get a very warm welcome, so thank you very much. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to acknowledge Jim himself and the other very distinguished guests that he mentioned at the start of the evening. So South Australia, first of all, is clearly an important part of Australia's history, but it's important for us POMs too. 6.6% of the Adelaide population is British born. And I have a personal connection, which is that my husband's aunt and uncle and his two first cousins moved here as £10 POMs in the 1970s and made Adelaide and Australia their home, and never looked back. And whenever I come here, I can quite understand why that is. I think it's a beautiful town with, I know, some challenges, but also, I'm sure, also a very bright future. And of course, this university itself has some terrific links with the UK, including the Chancellor himself, Jim McDowell, born in Belfast, educated in Warwick, and Deputy Vice-Chancellor Nigel Relf, who's also a Brit. And recently we did a bit of research looking at, well, what are the university links between the UK and Australia? And one of the things we discovered is that around half of the Chancellors and Vice-Chancellors in Australian universities are British or have spent substantive periods of time in the UK. So that university collaboration, I think, stems and flows from that. And of course, the university has a long-standing relationship with the University College London, covering fields such as engineering, advanced manufacturing, and sustainable energy. And this year, in fact, the two universities signed a £2 million partnership sponsored by Santos and the South Australian Government, which includes some exciting new initiatives such as women-only fellowships, a joint PhD programme, and dual-taught postgraduate degrees. So there's an awful lot here going on, and I will continue to build on that in the years ahead. I am getting to the topic, I promise, in a second, but I first had to come back on the cricket and just say that, you know, it's a very interesting time at the moment to be a POM in Oz, and I've been very excited about the Ashes and other sporting events this weekend as well. So, as Jim's intimated, it hasn't been going too well really on the cricket. And the latest score is England at 202 for 7, chasing an Australian total of 442. So it's not looking very good, but we have actually got two batsmen in there who are staying in for more than 5 minutes and doing much better than others higher up the order, so you never know. I'm going tomorrow, so I really hope it's not all over by then, though I fear it might be. And I'm sure that Donald Bradman, the most famous Adelaide resident as was, the statue of him is probably still wearing that Australian cricket jumper that I saw the statue sporting the other day. And then I'd hoped maybe to take some comfort from the Rugby League World Cup final, also at the weekend, and that didn't go too well either. I mean, England put on a mighty show, and it was a great battle, but as everyone knows, did go down to the Kangaroos, Australian team, by 6 points to 0. So it's not been great, but there are reasons to be cheerful when it comes to sport, because I'm actually Welsh, so I was much more interested. I was much more interested in the rugby union match this weekend, in which Wales defeated New Zealand, and in fact the weekend before that, Scotland also did very well, as I recall, beating Australia by 53 to 24. So, you know, there are things that we can focus on and things that we can celebrate, whether we're Australian or British. And in any case, I think think 2018 is going to be a fantastic year of sport in a way that really brings to life again the strength of the UK-Australia relationship. So we've got some regular events such as the Tour Down Under in South Australia, and I'll be here again hopefully cheering on Team Sky. But we've also got some big one-off events. We've got the Commonwealth Games up in the Gold Coast in April, and then that's followed by the Invictus Games in Sydney later in the year. And as I'm sure everybody knows, the Invictus Games is a really fantastic initiative led by Prince Harry for wounded, injured or sick armed services personnel and associated veterans. And it's become a really amazing and inspiring sporting event. So we're all looking forward to that. I don't know if Harry's bringing his new wife, Meghan. I'm getting asked that a lot. I hope he will, because I think that will again add more sort of glamour and excitement to the whole events. But as part of that, we have got a Sport is Great campaign going over the next few months, which is an opportunity not just to talk about the sport, but also about the UK-Australia links, be that technology, be that exports, be that our experience in stadium infrastructure and other areas. So sport is not just about cultural links and friendly rivalry. It's also a very big part of our economic relationship with each other, and we look to taking that further forward over the next few months. Indeed, cricket itself has some good examples of trading and entrepreneurial ties that link our countries. So we gave you Hawkeye, which I'm afraid is becoming too useful in calling British batsmen out LBW, and you gave us flashing cricket stumps and balls, and bails, invented by a graduate, I understand, of this very university. And I've definitely seen too much of that during England's innings. So, of course, I'm going back to the cricket again, so I'm going to stop there. That's it. No more on the cricket. And I'm going to move on to talk about the subject of this talk, which is our vision for Britain after Brexit. So, in essence, I think the vision is very simple. The UK wants a deep and special partnership with the European Union. We want the right deal overseas and the right deal for people and businesses in the UK. We want a set of closer relationships with our key like-minded overseas partners, including Australia. We want a country that's stronger, fairer, more united and more outward-looking than ever before. Now, at this point, when I'm talking about this, somebody, it might be a journalist or an academic or a politician, pops up and says, yes, but in the words of the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want. And I find that as the negotiations have started, and I'll come back to that, but there is an awful lot of gloom. And if you read publications coming out from the UK, a lot of them, I think, are very worried about Brexit and can tell quite a gloomy story, which is how I fixed on the title of this talk. And in a way, I raise you the Rolling Stones and I bring you Ian Dury and the Blockheads. Now, some of you might remember that band. They were a British band in the 1970s. They had a few hits. One was called Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick. That is not, as you can see, the subject of this talk. But one of their other greatest hits was Reasons to Be Cheerful, Part 3. And the original version of this song was released in 1979. It's basically a shopping list of all the reasons that there were at that time to be cheerful. And they included things like rock and roll singers, Buddy Holly, porridge, Elvis, a cure for smallpox, Woody Allen, Salvador Dali, saying okie dokie, and many, many others. Some aren't mentionable, by the way. So when I was thinking about Brexit, I thought about this song, Reasons to Be Cheerful, Part 3, and thought it was a good answer to a lot of the gloom and the pessimism that I'm hearing, and I'm sure you're hearing too, about Brexit. So here are my 3 reasons to be cheerful about the future. The first reason is negotiations are underway and are clearly making progress. So, as I said, we want a positive and constructive partnership with the EU, and we set that out several times. The Prime Minister's given speeches on it at Lancaster House in January and in Florence in September, and in our Article 50 letter we also set out some of those conditions for success. Formal negotiations started on the 19th of June, and the British government has been putting out a series of position papers about how we want to engage with the rest of the world and with Europe once we leave at the end of March 2019. There's 18 position papers, so if anyone's short of bedtime reading, feel free to have a read, but they do represent advanced and detailed policy thinking about our future outside the European Union. So in terms of the talks, there have been 6 rounds of formal talks so far, and our PM, Theresa May, has recently made an offer to settle the financial issues, and once that's agreed, which we hope it will be soon, that will allow talks to move on to other issues. And concrete progress has been made. It's a negotiation, it's behind closed doors, so we're not getting a running commentary on each and every issue, but I can say there is definitely progress on nuclear safeguarding, on civil judicial cooperation, and on citizens' rights for UK and EU nationals living in each other's countries. Yes, there remains some way to go, but there is progress. At the last European Council, there was a very useful dinner which Theresa May had with other European Union leaders, and it was European Council President Donald Tusk who actually said there was new momentum and that reports of a deadlock between the EU and the UK had been greatly exaggerated. So now we're looking ahead to the next European Council, which is at the back end of next week. You're already seeing some activity in preparation for that. So Theresa May is travelling to Brussels later today, to have lunch with Juncker, the President of the European Commission. And I think there's a sense of optimism that we will see some sort of breakthrough in the next few weeks. I think for the UK and for the UK public watching this, people want to move on to what's called stage 2 of the discussion. So stage 1 is very much about the separation issue, citizens' rights I've mentioned, the Irish border Jim has mentioned, and the divorce bill is the third. But I think we very much want to get on to talking about stage 2, which is more about future state. What will the future relationship actually look like? We've made very clear we want a frictionless relationship to trade and to invest with other EU countries, and that's the part of the negotiation that will follow once we get through stage 1. And if I may give a nod to Chris Martin, who's the lead singer of Coldplay and former husband of Gwyneth Paltrow, I remain confident that a conscious uncoupling is possible. So that's reasons to be cheerful, part 1. Part 2, I think, is the opportunities that lie ahead. So I really do see a very wide range of opportunities for the UK and for other countries once we Brexit. First of all, in our future relationship with Europe, and it's really important to stress that the referendum vote on 23rd of June 2016 was a vote to leave the EU, not a vote to leave Europe. And I do think this is really important. Britain is not abandoning Europe. It remains in Britain's national interest that the European Union should succeed after we've left. And our ties with Europe across trade, defence, intelligence, security, science and innovation, people-to-people links run very deep and will remain as we realise a new relationship. But there will also be fresh opportunities for the UK to become even more global and international in action and spirit. So our Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, visited Australia earlier this year. I was with him for 3 days in Sydney in August, and he gave a lecture, a Lowy lecture, which is worth a look online if you haven't seen it. And one of the things he said was, and when we do that deal with the EU, I believe we will create a solution that has been so long in the making. A strong EU, buttressed and supported by a strong UK, with each side trading freely with the other, and with the UK able to think about new opportunities in the rest of the world. So in other words, Britain's decision to leave the EU does not mean it's stepping back from the world. We hold fast to a vision of global Britain, which is respected abroad, tolerant at home, engaged in the world, and working with our international partners to advance the prosperity and the security of our citizens. And I've heard so many people say, oh yes, but the UK is going to turn in on itself, it's going to be consumed by the negotiations, it's not going to engage anymore in the world. But I don't think the evidence to date shows that, even during this period of negotiation, which is pretty intense and quite challenging. So you're seeing the The UK engaged in a range of issues, so for example working through the Security Council to try to contain the threat emanating from DPRK. You're seeing ministers, including the Prime Ministers, out and about, still very much engaged in international affairs. And certainly in Australia, I'm getting more ministers down here than ever before, which some might say is a mixed blessing, but I wouldn't say that. I think it's great that they are taking the time to come all the way down here and meet with their Australian opposite numbers. So I mentioned Liam Fox, he was here last week. Boris Johnson and Michael Fallon were here in the summer, and we're expecting many more in the next few months. We had one Foreign Office Minister recently called Lord Ahmed, who was here to attend the Pacific Islands Forum, which was taking place in Samoa. And it's something that we haven't done before. We haven't got UK ministers down to that event, and it's something Australia wants to see as us more engaged in the Pacific. Lord Ahmed also went to Fiji, and he told me, and I was quite shocked by this, he was the first government minister to visit there for 27 years. So I think you're already seeing British ministers responding to this intent to be more global, to be more international, and to really focus on a wider set of international relationships for the UK. There will also be big economic opportunities too. And I think we've had a lot of predictions going into Brexit about immediate doom, a recession, problems for the British economy, and by and large those haven't come to pass. And I think the economy has proved to be very resilient, and business has proved to be very resilient. So unemployment in the UK is at 4.3%. That's our lowest since the 1970s. GDP growth last year was nearly 2%. And when I talk to business, I get that real sense of pragmatism and also optimism that, provided we can negotiate a good deal with the European Union, that there'll be every reason to continue to invest with and work with the UK and invest in our markets and expand their operations. I think the other thing is that I think you'll hear a more vocal British voice championing free trade in the world at a time when there is growing protectionism and a lot of challenge to the rules-based international order around free and open trade. So according to the World Economic Forum, Britain is among the top 10 nations in the world when it comes to enabling trade, and that continues to help us attract investment and trade to our shores. And I think we have a very pro-business environment, including a corporate tax rate which is at 19%. That's already the lowest in the G20, and it will fall to 17% by 2020. So I think the opportunities in the UK on the economic side are also very obvious. Sorry, I've seen this happen to our Prime Minister, so I'm just going to pause and take a minute. So, of course, Brexit presents challenges. I'm not pretending that isn't the case. But we do remain one of the best places in the world to do business, and I think fresh opportunities will emerge in the post-Brexit world. And that takes me on to my third and final reason to be cheerful, which is, of course, the UK-Australia relationship. We describe this as a historic relationship, a modern partnership. Boris Johnson, when he was here, described it as a feast of reason, a flow of soul. And I really like that because I think it speaks both to all the facts and figures about the relationship, which are pretty compelling in themselves, but also the passion that we have for each other's countries, the deep intertwined history. I love a sporting banter, our shared values and our way of seeing the world. And we have so many opportunities to build further on those ties. So on the business side, for example, you've got new Australian retailers opening in the UK market. So Smiggle, Westfield, Bunnings are examples of that. As I like to say, we give you Scotch whisky, you give us sausage sizzles. There's another example which I love, which I'll share with you, which is that the Australian chain Donut Time is opening in Shaftesbury Avenue in the heart of London. So Londoners too will get to experience the Donatella Versace and a Pump Up the Jam donut. And I mean, these examples are just, they're vibrant, they're new. We're hearing of new examples every week. That's on the business and investment side. I wanted to touch a little bit on some of the new initiatives that we're seeing that touch on South Australia in particular. So you're seeing new inward investment coming into this state from big British companies. So the UK-owned Liberty House Group, led by Sanjeev Gupta, has just invested in the steelworks in Whyalla and other Arium facilities across South Australia. And that's a huge vote of confidence by British industry in this part of the world. Last month there was a visit here by our Defence Minister, Harriet Baldwin, in support of deepening cooperation between the British and Australian defence industries. And of course, we already have a very, very big presence here. I can see Nigel Stewart from BAE Systems sitting just there. I mean, one of the longest established defence companies in Australia, 60 years BAE Systems have been here, and today they employ over 3,000 people. And of course, as people know, they're bidding to design and build the next generation of Australia's future frigates, which would be a massive win, I think, for Australia and a massive win for UK design and technology. And talking of frigates, we announced last week that a Type 23 frigate called HMS Sutherland will be sailing all the way down to these waters very soon, and will visit Adelaide as well as Sydney and Perth, which again is an opportunity to really deepen those defence partnerships. Other partnerships, the cities of Adelaide and Manchester are working together, linking city and state authorities, plus universities, business and the civil sector. And the UK and South Australia are forging closer links in education, not just in the universities, but also in terms of primary school skills and learning from each other in how we teach kids reading through the use of phonics. I mean, I could go on, and I won't, but I think the key point is that we want to make it easier for UK and Australian companies to do business with and invest in each other's countries. So that's why just over a year ago, the two governments agreed to establish a bilateral trade working group which will scope out the parameters of a future free trade agreement between the UK and Australia. And these discussions were given a big boost last week by Liam Fox when he was here. He met the Prime Minister as well as Julie Bishop and of course Steve Chobo to talk about how we can really thicken up that work so that when we do leave the EU, we're ready to start negotiations and hopefully conclude them very quickly with Australia. And as Liam Fox said, Australia is one of our top 3 priorities for a future trade deal, the others being the US and New Zealand. I do hear some people saying, well, yes, but this relationship's in decline because Australia's only really focused on Asia. But I don't think that's the case. If you look at the new Australian Foreign Policy White Paper, it describes the UK as one of Australia's most important partners. And if you look at the statistics, that feast of reason, as Boris would put it, the UK is still the second biggest investor in Australia and the second biggest overseas destination for Australian investment. We are Australia's 5th largest trading partner. There are 1 million visits by Australian tourists to the UK every year. And we've seen that figure go up by 12% in the first 6 months of this year. But in these contested and challenging times that we all live in, I also believe the flow of soul is more important than ever. That sense of trust, shared values, and deep and abiding mutual affection between our two countries. And if you extend that outwards, then you can start looking at the Commonwealth of Nations, 52 countries from around the world who have so much in common in terms of shared values and interests. And one of our priorities for the coming year is to revitalise the Commonwealth and make sure that it's as relevant to the challenges of tomorrow as it has been historically. And I'm delighted to say that we, the UK, will be hosting the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in April in London, straight after the Commonwealth Games here. So that'll be a big Commonwealth month for both of us next April. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm getting near the end, getting near questions, but those are my 3 reasons to be cheerful. So just to recap, number 1, we're on the way. Detailed negotiations have started and we're making progress. Number 2, there's many, many new opportunities ahead. Challenges too, of course, but ultimately we can look ahead to the UK to become more active globally and to be international in spirit. And thirdly, I think there's a bright future ahead for the UK-Australia relationship. I'm very proud to be part of that. It's a great great privilege to be High Commissioner here when all of this very exciting stuff is going on. And it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here today in this wonderful state of South Australia. Last thing I want to share with you, as a sort of omen, if you like, is that when I stepped off the plane at Adelaide earlier today, the first thing I saw was a big quote up on the wall, and I always read those sort of inspirational quotes. And this one was from Henry Ford, and it said, "When everything seems to be going against you, remember that the aeroplane takes off against the wind, not with it." Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, High Commissioner, for that very erudite, accessible and crisp overview of Brexit. I think one of the things that really struck me, hearing you outline the overview, was Brexit's often been presented by the media especially as a story of endings. And I think what you've highlighted tonight is that it's also a story of new beginnings. You seem to be picking much of this up from your engagement here in Australia, with industry, with business and with communities. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about the personal side of that.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think I'm picking it up from a couple of things. One is actually British ministers coming out here is always really great. I said to Liam Fox after he'd been here last week and we were saying goodbye and I was sending off to the airport, having him here was like a shot of adrenaline, because I think, it's really great to hear from people who are at the coalface of this in the UK and can tell you their story about how it's going and the opportunities that they see. And again, you don't always get that, I think, from reading parts of the press. But you're absolutely right. I think in the Australia context, of course there's different views. People have very different views about whether Brexit is a good thing for UK, the future of the UK, whether that be economic growth or our role in the world. But I think, a lot of Australians are deeply pragmatic, and I think people accept that it's happening and that therefore what we need to do is to focus on how to make it work, how to make it successful, and the opportunities that can flow from that. I speak to business all the time. I think they are anxious, as I intimated, to move forward from this period of uncertainty and to understand what the future relationship between the UK and the EU will look like. But subject to that, basically they're still very confident in the UK economy, confident in our excellence in areas like tech, financial services, and very keen to stay engaged.
I think the other thing with Brexit, certainly from the standpoint of the media, much of it was presented too as if it literally kind of came out of nowhere, as if it was lacking an historical context. And I want to bring in history just for a moment, partly because I work with an historian, Nigel Ralph. But I think it actually is important, because I was looking back to, if you go back to Winston Churchill's very famous speech that he gave in Zurich in 1946, where he cast the British Empire in the role of a benevolent godfather to a united Europe. And it was in that speech that he actually called for what he described as the United States of Europe, but tellingly, the UK was not to be a part of that in Churchill's version. So, right from the very beginning there, the empire stands outside of the US of Europe, or in today's idiom, outside of the EU, but not, as you were saying, I think it's a very important point in your lecture where you were saying, not Europe itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a very sort of interesting question. And of course, you're absolutely right about the United States of Europe allusion by Churchill himself, although I'm not sure that he necessarily meant what Juncker means when he talks about ever closer political union. We've moved a long way over the last 50 to 60 years. What I would talk about is my experience as somebody, growing up in the UK. And I certainly have always felt, in a way, that we're sort of part of Europe, but also that we have had that sort of semi-detached mentality. And I think it's partly about geography. It's partly about, being separated by the English Channel and the North Sea from the continent of Europe. But I think a lot of it's about our history as well, and as you imply, our very global history over the previous 200, 300, 400 years, and that leading to a sort of different mentality in the UK. And I think when you look back, and much cleverer people than me have tried to analyse, why did the vote go the way that it did? But I think it's that issue about political union that is quite uncomfortable to people, many people in the UK, who sort of really saw this as an economic enterprise and saw value in that to the UK. But lots of people will say, but it was going in directions that we just didn't feel comfortable with, and that sort of progressive loss of national sovereignty. I think you can't underestimate that as a real factor driving the Brexit vote.
I want to jump from the UK to Germany for a moment. The celebrated German intellectual Jürgen Habermas, responding to Brexit, penned an article where he criticised governments, interestingly both the UK government but many European governments as well, for what he called the handing out of tranquilizers. The handing out of tranquilizers. I thought it was quite a lovely phrase. In it, what he seemed to be getting at was he lamented the current technocratic approach in the public debate over whether the UK is going to be in or out of the single market. And instead of actually having a public debate about the future of Europe itself and of kind of wider social solidarity between the UK and Europe. Are you sympathetic to any of that? Do you think there's merit to that kind of criticism? The governments are very short-term and too short-term for their own good.
Yes and no. So, yes, in a way I agree that there's sort of bigger and longer term issues at stake around actually social cohesion and a shared sense of enterprise, I suppose, in terms of how the UK and Europe relate to each other and how we see the world. And, I think on this I'm actually quite optimistic, because I think, again, it comes down to shared values and common interests. And I think, long after we've left the EU, a lot of those will still coexist. And, some of the challenges we've got in Western societies, whether that be Europe or Australia or the United States, are all very sort of similar to each other. So I think focusing on that as an issue that we all need to address, I think, is right. I think I'm less sympathetic to the tranquilizers argument, because the reality is, for now, we have to focus on the negotiations, and we have to get this done in order to turn our minds to those great, weighty, longer-term issues. So, I think we need to do both. We need to negotiate and think about the short term, but not lose sight of our longer-term objectives. And ultimately, what's at stake here, I think, is the health of our societies, and making sure that future generations can prosper in the way that we have been able to do in our lifetimes. And that, for me, is something that is something we'll just come back to again and again.
On the pragmatics, how can the Irish border work?
Well, it was Jim that was saying earlier on, if you can explain this, you don't understand it. So I might just stick on that. A couple of things. First of all, we have made very clear that we don't want to return to a hard border, we being the United Kingdom. Ireland doesn't want to return to a hard border. And in fact, if you look at the people side of things, I think the fact that Ireland is not a member of the Schengen Agreement means that they have got controls already on people coming in from other parts of the EU where there is freer movement. So I suspect the issue will be more about goods and services, and where you sort of draw the line in terms of the customs union. But this is all subject to negotiation, and like everyone else, I'm just going to have to wait and see how that comes out.
Yeah, and with that, the whole divorce bill, of course, divorces can be very complicated and messy, and we're seeing expensive. The media reporting over the weekend now figures of up to £50 billion. The question that I'd like to raise with you is, this is uncharted territory, isn't it? Part of what's difficult here is the fact that it's experimental territory, that countries haven't really gone here before. And as you say, it's going to be very complex and very involved.
Yeah. But just because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean it can't be done. So we're the first ones to do this, we may be the last. And I think in terms of I don't really like the language of divorce. I prefer the conscious uncoupling, because I do think as in any sort of separation, of course there's some wrangling about the costs of that, but ultimately if there's children involved, I'm not sure where I'm going with this metaphor, but if there's kids involved, you want a good agreement for the sake of the kids. And I think in this case, apart from the money side of things, there is so much interest on both sides in having a decent outcome to this. And there must be a win-win there, which will enable both sides to prosper in the future. And it's worth remembering, I think, that in trade terms, at least, arguably the EU's got more to lose than the UK if there isn't a deal, because the trade surplus is on our side, not on the EU side. So, I hope there's enough incentive for a win-win and a conscious uncoupling style of arrangement rather than anything more nasty.
Yeah, I suspect the papers will continue to go with the divorce rather than the conscious uncoupling.
I fear so too, but it's a matter for them.
Menna, in Parliament some time ago, Lord Tony Giddens, the former director of the LSE, or former alma mater, argued in Parliament that he thought Brexit reflected all sorts of divisions arising over throughout the UK. But he pointed out critically that UK policy, he thought, had engaged EU trade without any simultaneous deepening of cooperation. So he referenced things like no Schengen, no Euro, and pointed out that, if you look back over the 44 years of EC membership, it's arguable. He made the point that it's arguable that a more robust UK policy debate on both the fortunes and the misfortunes of the EU was needed. With hindsight now, I guess, do you think that's the case? Do you think, why was there a reluctance in the UK to have a more upfront debate on the question of European reform, firstly? And second, would it have helped if there'd been that more robust debate prior to the actual Brexit vote?
Well, it's an interesting set of questions, but hindsight is everything, and we don't know how things would have worked out if they'd been handled differently. I think what things like Euro and Schengen show is what you were talking about earlier on, actually, or we were talking about, which is that the history of the UK's involvement in the EU has not necessarily been straightforward, and there were reasons why choices were made not to join in those things, and often it was about fear of losing choice and control, which I think is why the Brexit, the pro-Brexit campaign around taking back control really hit a chord with people, because that was the thing I think that Britain feared losing most. Should we have had a more robust debate about it? Well, I remember quite robust debates about the Euro in particular during the Blair-Brown years, and it was decided not to go down that route. And frankly, I think, given where we are now, it's probably just as well that we didn't join those things, because if we think it's difficult and complex now, it could have been a hell of a lot worse. So I wouldn't necessarily see that as a bad thing.
There's been the extraordinary situation over the weekend where former British Prime Minister Tony Blair has now publicly intervened, calling for a second referendum, not something that former Prime Ministers are known necessarily to actively get involved in. More complexity, obviously, to an already complex situation?
Well, there's a track record in both our countries, I think, of prime ministers getting involved in issues once they've departed the prime ministership. But I won't talk about Australia. In terms of the UK, everyone's got a voice, and Tony Blair's got a voice as much as anyone else. But I think you've got to look at public opinion, and for the time being, at least, there hasn't been a big shift. And there's a lot of speculation: would people vote the same today if they'd voted? Would they vote the same today if they had the chance? And I don't think we deal in hypotheticals. What we do know when we look at the opinion polls is that I think the latest one shows that of people who voted leave, only 7% are even sort of half questioning their original decision. And what I hear talking to people when I'm back in the UK is an awful lot of people who voted remain really wanting to give this a best shot. And I think, we're a democracy. There was a referendum, it was a clear result, and people want to see that through, do the negotiation and see how it works. And I think that's where we are as a country, and Tony Blair's entitled to his opinion about that.
I know lots of people want to come in at this point. Can I ask you just one more question? Just because it came up there where you mentioned giving Brexit the country's best shot. With your ambassadorial crystal ball, could I ask you to look, say, 20 or 25 years down the track? What would you most like to see for global Britain, particularly in its engagement with Australia, and the possibilities that you see for that relationship?
That's a really great question. I mean, there's so much I'd like to see, and I think it all stems from the global Britain idea and some of the ideas I was mentioning in my speech. But, you know, I think the reality is that we do live in this sort of complex and contested and challenging world, and I think we're all going to need to be more nimble and proactive about building different sets of international alliances in response to specific threats. So, just as an example, I think there's discussion at the moment about the Quad. This is the Australian, Japan, India, US Quad as some sort of, you know, possible answer to containing threats in the region. I find that really interesting. There's the Commonwealth, which I think if we can re-energise it, has a much bigger role to play when it comes to creating a more sustainable and fairer future, with a much better track record across the Commonwealth on governance and on delivery against the Sustainable Development Goals. When I look at the Five Eyes Alliance, which we're part of with Australia and New Zealand and Canada and the US, that's focused mainly on sort of security and intelligence. But to me, it could be a really powerful voice when it comes to thinking about some of these big foreign policy challenges, and we could look to lean into that a bit more. So I see a UK in 20 or 30 years which is even more active than we are now on the global stage, but, you know, really building different alliances in response to specific issues based very much on common values. And again, going back to the Australian white paper that's just been published, I really like the strength of the values piece within that, and I think that's something we're all going to need to lean into in the decades to come.
Well, let's at this point now welcome in the audience to this conversation. We've got some roving mics to go around. If you could just indicate with your hand, and yes, we're going to bring a lady there in the... Thank you very much. We can keep our questions because I think a lot of people are going to have questions, so short and focused. Thank you.
Okay, two questions. What percentage of Britons actually voted compared to 70% of Australians who voted in the survey for marriage equality that wasn't compulsory? And the second question, do you think that the move more to the right in Britain and in Europe was the reason that Brexit was passed or brought up?
Thank you. Thanks for the questions. On percentage, I'd have to go and fact check, but I think that the percentage in the plebiscite was more like 79%, if I'm not wrong, and I think in the Brexit vote it was near 70%. I've got fact checker Chris in the front row who might be able to put me right on that, but that's from memory, and I think, sorry? 72%, thank you. So I think that's a strong turnout, actually, for a voluntary referendum, as it was here for a plebiscite. And, you know, I actually think it's great when you get participative democracy. And, you know, I have this debate with a lot of Australians about compulsory voting versus a volunteer system. And I'm quite passionately attached to volunteerism. And I think a lot of Australians are quite passionately attached to compulsory voting because it mitigates against some of these slightly unpredictable results you can sometimes see. But I've heard a lot of people really celebrate that high participation rate in the plebiscite that you've just had. I think it can be a powerful thing, which then we all need to respect in terms of how we take forward policies. Move to the right in the UK. I mean, I challenge a little bit that statement, because if you look at the most recent general election, both main parties did very well and actually took a far higher share of the vote than, let's say, the two main parties did here in the Queensland election. So I think between them, the Labour and Conservative Party in the last election took around 80% of the vote. So I don't think it's that simple as saying Britain has moved to the right. I think there was definitely a very strong showing by UKIP in the last few years in the run-up to the referendum. But I have to say, I think they were pushing very hard specifically on the Europe issue itself. And yes, I think concerns about immigration associated with that. But it'll be interesting to see now that that issue's been dealt with, what actually happens to the right-wing vote in the UK. As for Europe, yes, I think there's an issue. And I think it's the issue that we're all seeing, which is about the sort of fragmentation of voters, people moving more to the fringes in terms of their views. And there's a lot of debate about, why that's happening, which we haven't really got time for. But I think it's partly to do with pressures of, refugees, pressures of inequality, and other such things. So I think it's a trend that is quite worrying and that we all need to watch.
Question from the gentleman here at the front.
Madam Commissioner, I noticed that you weren't wearing any glasses today, but had you been, they would certainly have been very rose-tinted. There was no robust debate because all the people who were thought to matter in the United Kingdom were all going to be Remainers. And I think it came as something of a surprise when Brexit pulled ahead in the last part of the race. I'm a little disconcerted that we've heard nothing about all those people who constituted most of the Brexit vote from you. We're hearing about business and trade and so on and future prosperity. All sounds a bit trickle down. What's going to happen and what are the beliefs faced with all this of the people who don't usually have much of a voice publicly?
Thank you. It's a great question, and I apologise for my rose-tinted non-spectacles. But I was being true to the subject of the talk, and I feel that it's important to correct the narrative that you do hear a lot, which is the very gloomy one. And I'm not saying that everything is rosy. Yes, the people that we don't hear from had their voice. I think that's true. And again, there's all sorts of reasons why that happened. But I think some of it is about, I've mentioned the word, is about inequality, and it's certainly something that I think the government is very determined to try to tackle, but it's difficult. The story I always tell, because it's a personal one, is my mum was born in the Rhondda Valley in South Wales, which was a great coal mining valley, and my grandparents were miners when they were young, and the mines have gone. You're in a situation of real post-industrial decline in those places, as you are actually in parts of this state as well, with the decline of the manufacturing industry. And I was in the Rhondda Valley just after the Brexit vote, and you can really feel why people there might have had a protest vote. And for them, voting to leave the EU was part of expressing that sense of anger and distance from the centre, be that Cardiff or be that Westminster. So I think it's really important that we listen to those people and that we respect the fact that they've had their voice, and that as the so-called elite, we don't try to unwind the result of the vote, that we absolutely respect it, and we continue to pay attention to the concerns of those people who found their voice in that referendum. So I agree with you.
There's a question from a woman. Sorry, just down here. Yep, we're just bringing you a mic, thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm about to move to Australia from the European Union, so unfortunately I will ask another critical question because I'm more in the gloom camp, I suppose. You have said a lot about the sort of positive international and global outlook of the UK. Now, a big part of that is, of course, British universities and the role they've played in the international university system. Now, talking to colleagues at British universities, there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen to them with the Brexit, about the visa regimes, what that means for international students, about the people working at British universities, because a lot of them are from the EU, but also, of course, about access to EU research funding and how this may or may not be replaced. So, do British universities have any reason to be cheerful, and what are they? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I think they do have reason to be cheerful. Partly because we have some of the best universities in the world. And I haven't got the percentage with me, but a very high percentage of universities in the world's top 10 or top 100 are British. And I honestly don't see that changing as a result of Brexit, because I think we'll still be able to attract intellectual capital to the UK. Now, I understand the concerns, particularly about research funding, and I think that's something we're going to have to work through in the negotiation phase. Of course, there's an issue about the future access to the UK by EU academics. I think in terms of students as well. But I think this goes back to what I was saying about leaving the EU but not leaving Europe. I think when it comes to our universities, I'm sure that there's a huge amount of interest in continuing to attract the brightest and best from Europe, as from all over the world, to our universities, whether that be students or whether that be academics. So I think some of the mechanisms we're going to have to look at, because they will need to change. But I don't believe it will fundamentally alter that sort of position. Now, I recognise that might sound a bit complacent, but I really believe that. And the other thing is, don't overlook the new opportunities that will result. So the links between UK and Australian universities, as I've already said, are phenomenal, as they are with American universities, and we're developing new partnerships in Asia. So I think you'll see a growth of those, which in a country like Australia, I think will be of huge value. Some of the new partnerships we're developing between some of the newer universities in the UK on sort of technology, STEM subjects, innovation, and some of the tech-focused universities here are really exciting. So I think this is an area where there will be some challenges in the short term, but in the long term, I'm confident about the health of the British tertiary education system.
All of the questions seem to be coming right from the very front here, and I'm going to come to you in one moment. We've got a lot of people sitting way up the back, so I'm just wondering, I'll come to you next. So, yes, the gentleman there with his hand up, thanks.
Thank you. Do you see the EU surviving without the massive British financial input? And why won't Theresa May tell us what the figure is that she's thinking about offering?
So, on the second question, I don't know, you'd have to ask her. No, sorry, that's a bit flippant. Seriously, because it's a negotiation, and I'm sure once there is an agreement on the figure, we'll all know it. I'm not sure we'll have absolute clarity on that immediately, by the way, because I think there's a bit of chicken and egg here. Can you really commit a final figure until you actually know what the outcome of the negotiation is and what some of the arrangements are, for example, on future research funding, etc. But I think the overarching reason is that it is a negotiation, and the minute you start playing this out more publicly than it's already sort of drifting out, I don't think it's very healthy. Sorry, I've forgotten your first question. What?
Will the EU survive?
Oh, yes.
Do you see the EU surviving without the massive British input financially? I don't think Germany can finance it on its own. France, okay, but the rest of the countries, there's 27 countries in the EU, and most of them do not contribute to the EU.
Yes, thank you for jogging my memory. I think, as I said in my talk, we are invested in the EU being successful in the future. We don't have some sort of Machiavellian plot here to try and tear it down as an institution, because we think it can continue to play a really good role in the world and for its member states. In terms of how that works financially, I think this is why there's this big debate about how much we should put in. We're very clear we're maintaining, or we're delivering on our financial obligations through to 2020, then some of this debate is, what does a tail for the UK contributions beyond that point look like, and how can that be managed in such a way that the EU doesn't go bankrupt overnight? Now, clearly, what your question is really about is it is an issue which you're absolutely right. We are a net contributor, a massive net contributor, so there will be an issue there about the affordability of the EU budget. But maybe the EU will have to make some choices about what it spends money on in those circumstances. And God knows in the UK we've been dealing with austerity and trying desperately to reduce our fiscal deficit since the global financial crisis, now with some success, but it's a very long process. And I think, maybe the EU will need to look a bit harder at what it's spending its money on.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Here's second row.
Hi, I'm curious about whether or not there are reasons to be cheerful about Britain's commitment to environmental standards in a post-EU era. I know that a lot of that was driven by being a part of the EU, so is there potential to go beyond that?
That's a good question. I mean, we are absolutely committed to environmental standards, and I think, I can't be specific about exactly how that will translate into future policy. I would say a couple of things. One is that we've got this EU withdrawal bill going through the House at the moment, and one of the things that's seeking to do is to lift and shift an awful lot of EU regulation, all the sort of things that we've signed up to over the last 40 years into UK law. So I think that'll sort of be our starting point. But after that, I think we'll want to make our own decisions and choices about that. I know that Michael Gove, who's our Secretary of State for Agriculture, for example, is passionate actually about environmental standards within the farming industry. And of course, we have a very strong track record when it comes to reducing emissions. So we've reduced emissions by 40% since, again, I'd have to fact check, I think it's since 2005, or it might be 2000. Chris looking. Well, anyway, we've done a really good job, and we're at the leading edge of climate change policy. We're we've got one of the best track records when it comes to renewable power and the growth of, for example, the offshore wind industry in the UK. So I don't think any of that is going to change, and I don't think those sorts of fundamentals driving our approach to environmental policy of whatever kind are going to deviate much.
Well, sadly, we're out of time there on the questions.
Quite glad, actually. They were quite tough questions. Thank you.
As they say on ABC's Q&A, we hope you keep this going on Twitter. But for the moment, I'd like to welcome back to the podium the Chancellor, Jim McDowell.
Thank you. I do remember as a child in Belfast, and a newspaper headline in the Daily Mail, I think there had been some terrible storms in the Channel, and all of the ferries had to stop running, all of the airlines had to stop flying, so there was no movement. And the headline in the Daily Mail was "Continent Isolated," which I think sums up Britain's somewhat ambivalent attitude to the Scots accepted with the continent of Europe. So first of all, thank you very much, Menna, for your insightful presentation. I certainly do hope that Europe will settle into the familiar rhythms of after divorce, or conscious uncouplings. Let me just remind everybody here that tonight's talk will be available on the Hawke website by the end of next week, so you'll have plenty of opportunities to hear it again. Until then, thank you for coming out this evening. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas and New Year celebration, and I look forward to seeing you all again next year. Thank you again, Menna.